The Maze Prison Escape. The HM Prison Maze, located near Belfast in Northern Ireland, was long considered to be one of the most secure and inescapable prisons in Europe. During the near 40-year conflict known as the Troubles, the maze housed paramilitary prisoners from the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, who were all sentenced for trying to topple the British-controlled governmental structure of Northern Ireland and had orchestrated dozens of violent attacks across the region. What made the maze so difficult to escape was not only its massive security detail, but also the structure of the prison itself. The compound consisted of 8 self-contained H-shaped prison blocks called, H-blocks. Creative. In each H block, the middle part of each H was considered a restricted area and housed the control room for the block. The escape's leader, Bobby Story, and a man named Gary Kelly had begun working as orderlies in the restricted area of the H7 block. This was the only way prisoners were allowed in the area, but even with access to this restricted area, the control room for the block was still under lock and key. At least, it was, as Kelly and Story spent months working in H7, slowly but surely befriending the guards. Eventually, the pair gained the guards' trust with their long con, and the restricted area had somewhat more of an open-door policy. Kelly and Story managed to obtain 6 small firearms which had been smuggled into the prison. With the relaxed guards and their new weapons, the men were ready to make their break. On September 25, 1983, the prisoners, led by Story, attacked and seized control of the H7 block, overpowering officers, taking their uniforms and weapons, and preventing any of them from sounding the alarm. Several hours later, the prisoners intercepted a food delivery truck. Threatening the driver, they told him to follow their instructions or else. 37 prisoners piled into the back of the truck while Gary Kelly lay on the ground in the cab beneath the driver, pointed his gun at him, and ordered him to drive to the main gate. This is where things got wild. At the main gate, the escapees tried to overtake the gatehouse, and initially the guards were taken hostage, but within 5 minutes they began to fight back. Alarms were sounded, and new guards coming into work during a shift change quickly noticed the scene. A huge brawl with knives and guns erupted, in which one guard lost his life after suffering a heart attack after being stabbed by an inmate. Imagine taking your first few steps into work and seeing a group of almost 40 nearly escaped prisoners beating up on all your coworkers. That'll cause a case in the Mondays. In the chaos, most of the escapees made it to the prison perimeter, where they expected to be greeted by 100 IRA soldiers who were to provide them backup and help them escape. Unfortunately for them, the IRA miscalculated the time, and when the prisoners breached the prison walls, their backup was nowhere in sight. Run! With no help, the prisoners began hijacking more vehicles or running away on foot. While most of the prisoners were eventually recaptured, 2 escapees have never been found. The Maze prison escape was a huge propaganda boost for the IRA and a huge embarrassment for Northern Ireland's government, leading to major security reviews and legislative changes. El Chapo's tunnel escape. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was arguably the most infamous and powerful drug kingpin of all time. At his peak, his net worth was estimated to be over $1 billion. He's currently in prison for life in Colorado, but while active, he managed to escape from numerous Mexican prisons in extravagant fashion, his most famous escape being his epic tunnel escape in 2015. In 2015, El Chapo was being held in Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, otherwise known as Altiplano Prison, a maximum security prison in Mexico. On July 11, 2015, while being monitored by security guards via camera, El Chapo casually stepped into the shower area of his cell, which coincidentally was the only part of the cell without constant video surveillance. While it initially seemed like El Chapo was just deep in some shower thoughts, the guards got suspicious when he was still showering 25 minutes later. They went to investigate, and upon entering the cell, El Chapo was gone. In the shower, a floor tile had been propped open, revealing an enormous tunnel leading under the prison. Authorities followed the mile-long tunnel and popped up on the other side, where they found a bare field with some sparse shells of houses and no Mexican drug lord in sight. El Chapo was gone. So, how did he do it? Being the most powerful drug lord of his time, El Chapo had plenty of men at his disposal. His cronies bought up a plot of land right outside the prison complex, and to avoid suspicion, they staged it like a construction site, building up brick shells of small homes to make it seem like they were simply there building houses. However, every day, instead of building houses, the men were digging. With nothing but pickaxes and shovels, El Chapo's men tunneled from their small plot of land directly underneath the crime boss's cell. The entire project took about 16 months, and once they reached El Chapo, he was gone in a matter of minutes. The crazy thing about this escape, however, isn't El Chapo's journey through the tunnel, it's the tunnel itself. See, when you're worth upwards of $1 billion, you don't escape through any old dingy, dirty tunnel. Authorities couldn't believe how intricate the entire system was, especially for having been built in only 16 months. The tunnel was reinforced with wooden panels, lights, and even a ventilation system that pumped fresh air throughout the entire length. Even more unbelievable than the ventilation, though, was the rail system. El Chapo's men had laid down metal tracks throughout the entirety of the tunnel and used a small modified motorcycle to remove the dirt from the tunnel to their plot of land outside the prison, spreading it around the empty fields to avoid suspicion. On that fateful day in July, after hearing scraping sounds coming from his shower, El Chapo casually hopped down into the tunnel and rode on the small motorcycle along the tracks to the fake construction site. There, he escaped into a car waiting for him. This escape was a massive embarrassment for the Mexican government. It showed just how much influence El Chapo had, and how corrupt the system was, considering plenty of bribing was done along the way to make sure the tunnel was undetected and headed in the right direction. El Chapo is probably the only man in history to escape prison underground on a motorcycle in an air-conditioned tunnel. In typical El Chapo fashion, even his prison breaks were done in style. The Great Escape. During World War II, over 600 Allied prisoners of war participated in one of the largest-scale prison escapes in history. Stalag Luft III, or Main Camp Air 3, was a German POW camp run by the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's Air Force. The prison was massive at over 60 acres and held over 10,000 Allied POWs. In March of 1943, a South African RAF squadron leader named Roger Bushell cooked up the prison break of the century. This escape plan was historic not only in the scale of construction required, but also in the scale of hopeful escapees. Other attempts to escape had usually involved a maximum of 20 prisoners, but Bushell's plan aimed for the liberation of 200 allies. In a nutshell, the plan was to dig 3 separate tunnels, nicknamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, originating at 3 different areas of the prison. The idea was if the Germans found one tunnel and sealed it off, they wouldn't assume that there were more. All 3 tunnels aimed to pass underneath the prison compound to the tree line outside the walls. Tunnel Tom was the first to be discovered by the Germans, and it was filled with dynamite and destroyed. Tunnel Dick, which had the most hidden trapdoor of the 3 tunnels, had to be abandoned when it was discovered that the area it was originally going to end had been cleared for prison expansion. However, the Dick tunnel was able to serve a special purpose. Get your mind out of the gutter. Dick was ultimately used to store supplies and soil that had been removed from the other tunnels, but more on that later. That left Tunnel Harry as the Allies' only hope. The tunnel took over a year to complete, and while it was similar to El Chapo's in some ways, it was much less luxurious. The tunnel was deep underground, almost 30 feet, and the shaft itself was only a 2-foot by 2-foot square. No motorcycle rides through this bad boy. A huge part of the operation of the Great Escape was finding a place to secretly scatter all the dirt dug up from the tunnels being built. The prisoners employed several methods to try and discreetly get rid of the stuff. Some of them would stuff their long underwear with dirt and soil so that it slowly dribbled out of their pant legs as they walked around. Kind of like when you're trying to make it to the bathroom 15 minutes after eating Taco Bell. More dirt was secretly added to garden beds tended to by prisoners, and more dirt was stuffed into Tunnel Dick. Finally, in March of 1944, Tunnel Harry was completed, and the big day had arrived. Allied POWs, with the help of several anti-Nazi Germans in and around the prison, had successfully obtained hundreds of pieces of civilian clothing, forged travel documents, identification, and anything else they would need to make it to safety once on the other side. Now, while over 600 allies had helped in crafting the tunnels, only 200 were ultimately selected for the escape. The prisoners were broken into 2 groups of 100. The first, called the serial offenders, were those who had the highest chance of success, roughly 30 of whom spoke German and had experience breaking out of POW camps. The next 70 were men who had done the most work in the tunnels. The second group of 100 was chosen simply by drawing straws, and they were equipped with extremely basic tools, equipment, and travel papers. Their nickname? The Hard Arsers, which I guess is what you needed to be to try to escape a German POW camp with no German language ability, tools, or supplies.
Help!
On March 24th, the Allies waited until nightfall, got into position, and began the escape. They immediately hit their first roadblock. The latch on the trapdoor had completely frozen shut. This delayed the escape by an hour and a half. Imagine getting all that adrenaline going and then realizing you had to quietly exhale on the latch for 90 minutes before you could even get started. Once they got the thing opened, they ran into roadblock number 2. The tunnel was short of the tree line, and the tunnel exit was in clear view of a nearby guard tower. While the plan had originally been for a prisoner to escape every minute, the Allies were forced to slow that down to about 10 per hour to avoid detection. It was ultimately decided that no one in the second group would get a chance to try and escape that night. Other roadblocks? An air raid shut off electricity in the tunnel, and a small cave-in grinded everything to a halt and needed to be repaired around 1 a.m. But these problems aside, 76 prisoners were able to crawl to safety before the 77th was spotted by the guard in the tower. The prisoners scattered, but ultimately, 73 of the 76 who got out were recaptured. On Adolf Hitler's direct orders, 50 were executed, among them the mastermind Roger Bushel. Stalag Luft III was eventually liberated by the Allies in 1945, but the Great Escape showed just how hard the POWs were willing to work to break free from Nazi control. 600 prisoners working around the clock digging 3 tunnels. Hitler definitely did not see this coming. Sorry. Escape from Alcatraz. Located on a small island in the San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz Penitentiary was once home to the country's most dangerous criminals. The prison was world famous for its high security and its near impossibility of escape, due to the freezing waters of the bay and the nearest land being 1 mile away. While escape from the Rock was viewed as impossible, all of that changed on June 12, 1962, when 3 prisoners, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence Anglin, failed to make their morning calls. When a guard investigated Morris's cell, he found Morris sound asleep in bed. To wake him up, the guard gave him a tap on the head with his nightstick, and to his horror, Frank's head fell clean off. After getting over the shock of thinking he had just decapitated a prisoner, the guard realized that the head was made out of paper mache, and Morris was missing. Upon searching the cells of the Anglin brothers, the guards found the same scene. The 3 men were gone. So, how did they do it? Well, it turns out there was another man, Alan West, who was meant to be the 4th escapee, but on the night of the escape, he wasn't able to make it to the pre-planned meeting point in time and was left behind. A papier-mâché head was found in his cell, and fearing the punishment Alcatraz guards were known for, West explained the plan in its entirety to the guards. The 4 inmates knew each other from their previous incarcerations in Florida and Georgia, and while they were being held in adjacent cells in 1961, they began formulating their escape plan. In each of their cells was a small air vent. The salt air coming in through the vent from the surrounding bay weakened the concrete, and when the inmates discovered this, they began chipping away at the walls surrounding the vents. Over the span of 6 months, the men slowly enlarged the air vents to a size that was big enough that they could climb through. West secured some paint from his prison job, and the inmates used it to cover up the missing areas of the wall. When the holes became large enough to be noticeable, they crafted dummy vents with paper mache to put over their tunnels and hide them from the guards whenever they did their hourly glances inside the cell. Once the holes were big enough, they made their way through their tunnels to an abandoned utility corridor directly behind their cells. The 4 inmates turned this corridor into their makeshift workshop, with their fake papier-mâché heads on their beds fooling the guards as they worked. They spent hours in the corridor crafting wooden paddles and a raft made from prison-issued rubber raincoats. On the night of June 11, 1962, the men put their plan into action. Unfortunately for West, some cement he had used to reinforce his tunnel had hardened, making the tunnel itself narrower, and also fixing the vent into place. By the time he was able to break it loose and crawl through, he discovered the other men had left without him. Morris and the Anglin brothers climbed up a ventilation shaft to the roof, slid down a kitchen pipe, climbed up the 20-foot-tall barbed wire fences, and made their way to the shoreline. Allegedly, guards heard a crash when the prisoners broke out of the ventilation shaft, but it wasn't investigated. Once they made it to shore, they hid in a prison blind spot and inflated their raft with a stolen concertina, which they must have modded to be silent in some way, because how could the guards not hear an accordion being frantically played in the middle of the night? With their raft inflated, the men set sail for freedom across the cold San Francisco Bay. To this day, no one knows whether or not the men made it across the bay. Many believe they drowned in the rough, freezing waters, but in the years following the escape, evidence that the 3 men made it to freedom began to emerge. According to West, instead of heading 1 mile south to San Francisco, which everyone expected, the fugitives traveled 2 miles north to Angel Island. In 2003, an investigator found a report of a stolen car on the same night as the escape. An eyewitness account claimed to have seen 3 suspicious men inside the stolen blue Chevy. And later, a second eyewitness reported being run off the road by a blue Chevy driven by 3 men. While nothing has ever been confirmed, the Chevy very well may have been driven by the 3 escapees. The bodies of the men have never been found. No reports of sightings have ever been disclosed, and to this day, Morris and the Anglin brothers are being sought after by the US government. The sheer improbability of success and the possibility that they actually made it makes their escape from Alcatraz the greatest prison escape of all time.